Hello friends, and welcome to another reading vlog. This vlog is so extra exciting because I'm going to be doing a buddy read with my best friend. If you've seen my previous vlogs, the Shop With Me one specifically, you will recognize Stephanie. She is, again, my best friend. We've known each other since 7th grade, and she very recently, as in just yesterday, finished up law school, so now I can monopolize all of her time again with my book and TV recommendations. And I'm so very excited because the book we're going to be buddy reading in this vlog is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. And I have heard excellent things about this book. I did accidentally order 2 copies of it, so I gave the extra copy to my best friend, Stephanie, and since then we've been planning on reading this together. We're actually been doing a couple video chats in this vlog as well, so we can have some conversation back and forth about it, like a book club, and I'm so excited to bring you guys along for the ride. And yeah, so keep on watching if you're interested. And heads up, because Stephanie and I will be discussing the book, there will be spoilers. Usually in my vlogs I try not to spoil too much about the books, but where this is a buddy read and Stephanie and I are going to want to talk about plot points, there's going to be some spoilers, so just warning for you. If you want to read The Poppy War and don't want to be spoiled, maybe save this vlog for another time. If not, or if you've already read it, then feel free to continue watching. Well, first off, congratulations on law school. You're over it. It's done. It's behind you.
Oh, it's so wild. It doesn't feel like it.
So what do you know about this book, if anything, other than me just shoving it in your face and saying, read it?
Well, respectfully, you haven't shoved it in my face. You've just talked with me about it, and it's sounded so interesting. Literally from what you've told me, like, there's really not much else beyond that.
I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I don't know, like, a whole lot about this book other than, like, it's amazing. And from what I have seen, though, I know it takes, like, a lot of influence from Chinese history and takes specifically, like, the Opium Wars and the Second Sino-Japanese War, which in my brain was, like, much longer ago than it actually was. Like, that's the beginning of World War II. My impression of this book is it takes place in sort of, like, a proto-ancient China. It's, like, drawing inspiration from much more recent history than that. So I'm interested to see, like, the sort of technology they're dealing with. I know the main character Rin goes to, like, a military academy, and there is an element of magical realism as well, so I'm curious to see how, like, modern it gets and whatnot. So yeah, I think we're both really gonna enjoy this. I know that it is kind of heavy. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to, like, look up trigger warnings or anything for this, but I know it, like, this book really does deal with, like, the horrors of war, so I've heard it will destroy you.
I have not actually. That would maybe be a smart idea in advance. But now that you're mentioning, or like, I took one really quick glance at the inside cover, and then as you were talking about kind of a military academy, I think the only thing I recall her getting in, and that was kind of a surprise, and kind of like the class aspect to it as well. I think that's the only thing that, like, has stayed in my mind about the book. It's something that'll definitely be interesting for me because I think coming from a military background, not that I myself was in the military, but growing up with it, I think I tend to avoid books about war or things that kind of talk about it, not because I don't, like, I can't stomach it, but just kind of my own, like, experience or kind of opinions about it going in. So it will be a kind of more of a breath of fresh air in that way, that it's not something I typically read. But the magical realism interests me, and I'm very excited to see where this book will go.
That's the one thing I'm, like, a little, like, about going in. Like, I am very excited to read this, but as you know, I don't like body horror, so I'm hoping we don't see too much
or
of
definitely that's you can't have it without it. I think part of the aversion, especially with war stories and war history, especially World War II, World War I, is the sort of, like, gatekeeping that comes with that history. And I think a lot of times it kind of comes off as like, oh, well, like, women don't talk about it or women don't like it. And I think it's, like, a nice challenge to that, to read it, but to also see that, like, it's not just, like, the prototypical man who's been in the war experience that has a story about it. Like, women have just as much of a story in it. So being able to see it as well from the perspective of somebody who is a woman themselves writing it, I think that'll add an element to it that in the few other stories that I've read, I don't think really pops up quite as much. And with how traumatic war can be, I think magical realism is such a perfect genre to talk about it.
I think that kind of covers the introductory bases for the Poppy War, and I'm so looking forward to your reactions and further discussion about this. Again, I've been very eager to get into this one with you, so I'm so excited.
And now it's finally happening.
Of all the things I was expecting from this book, her freaking the fuck out over her period, like Carrie, was not one of them. Oh my god. Hello! So I finished part 1 of the Poppy War last night, and oh my god, it's been so good so far. I feel like so much has happened in this first like 250 something pages. Actually 215 pages. I'm blown away. I took notes on my phone, which I never do while I read, but there were just so many like really poignant passages and things I wanted to keep track of and take note of so I could mention in my conversation with Stephanie in a little bit. But yeah, so I am loving this so far, and I'm really eager to hear Stephanie's thoughts on it as well. So I'm gonna set up for our Zoom chat, and we'll be right back and to talk about part 1 of the Poppy War. I feel like a lot happened in this first part, like a lot, and then there was like a very casual 2-year like time jump at the end.
I would say the timing, or just like as time is passing, is not always like it's like clear in the way that she'll like the author will tell us like this much time has passed, but it kind of goes from like, oh, like I'm just expecting it to be like the next day at school, and then it's like months, like
the last couple pages of part 1, it like skips like 2 years ahead, and I was like, whoa, because even some of the other pacing beforehand was fast, but not quite that fast, and I was like, holy shit. But still, I thought she did a really good job at like, in just 200 pages, really establishing the story, getting a sense of the characters and her relationships with everybody else. I liked how Neza is like Draco Malfoy, basically. I think my first note about him was that Rin pops a bitch Neza in the face. Respect, but I feel like that's gonna haunt her later, and it definitely did.
Goodness, my first note was they're either going to eventually become a friend or they're a mortal enemy.
Like, I think they're gonna have to fight in the war together and sort of bury the hatchet between them.
But will they though, is my question. It's like, in one part of my mind, I'm like, yeah, like you're gonna have to if you want your society to survive. But on the other hand, it's like, ooh, are you going to be able to put your differences aside, or will it just be like, I will always hate you kind of vibe?
I sent you a Snapchat the other day as we were reading that Zhang is basically Jiraiya from Naruto.
So funny because when you said it, I think I was in the car and I was like,
hair and everything.
But it's similar. It's not, obviously, it would be weird if it was, he's pretty much exactly like Jiraiya, but when you mentioned it, it was like, wait a minute, like that's actually pretty spot on.
Yeah, it's definitely not the same, but I do like that there's a lot more to him than meets the eye, especially with this spirituality thing happening. He's the gatekeeper, right? Like,
you know what's funny? Because I literally didn't think about that.
He was singing the Smutty Gatekeeper song. She always makes a comment about how he looks ageless. They specifically mention with the trifecta that nobody knows what happened to the gatekeeper. And then towards the end, he's talking about how, like, everyone, like, you know, everyone returns to the spiritual realm. Well, most people. And I'm like, oh my god, he's the gatekeeper! I don't know what.
Like, I didn't think about it, but now that you say it, I'm like a little, like, shook right now thinking about it.
I'm really looking forward to learning more about his past, especially where he says he doesn't remember where he was during the Second Poppy War, like what happened. The last couple of pages felt like, whoa, because you kind of get this development of Rin and how she has this really deep respect for Jiang, but she also wants to be able to tap into this power, and he's kind of trying to steer her away from that. And she's got this sort of underlying, like, deceit thing happening now. And I was like, I wrote in my notes, I was like, I'm kind of getting, like, low-key Azula vibes right now. Where I'm like, oh no, is she the baddie?
I'm so conflicted with it because it's like, clearly Zhang wants the best for her. And especially where he saw what happened with Alton, it's like, I don't want that to happen to you. Especially when, the festival was happening and she sees the Empress for the first time. That whole dialogue, I was like, oh no, I don't like this.
I was expecting something to, like, go down. Like, I wrote that in my notes as well. I was like, oh my god, there's, like, a lot of tension right now. So I was waiting for something really big to happen, and then it was just the Empress thing. Like, there was this part where it's like the crowd started screaming, and I was like, what's happening? Are they being attacked? And it's like they were just screaming, like, for the Empress. And I was like, oh, okay. But there was, like, so much tension. In the parade, they had these sort of representations of, like, all the gods and stuff, and it made me think of the Chinese dragon scene from Mulan, where, like, that's how the Huns get into the city, and I was like, I don't know, it was just, like, it reminded me of that so much, like, that's part of why I think I was expecting something to happen. It was, like, it was familiar. You get this sort of impending sense of doom with, like, this war that's gonna happen. Then even in, like, sort of smaller individual scenes, I was like, wow, these fight scenes are written really well. Her entire fight scene in the, like, the competition with Neza, I was, like, holding my breath, because, like, you knew if he got the chance, he was just gonna beat the shit out of her, and, like, just where she was like, she could not let that happen.
We're so used to, I think sometimes with reading fight scenes as well, we're so used to them happening, like, super quick, fast paced, that it's like we want to encapsulate that sort of energy. Where, like, the sort of slow vibe of, like, you know, this is obviously happening really fast, but I'm watching you to see how you're gonna attack. Like, it's very satisfying because I don't think it happens all the time.
The stakes just felt so high. I wasn't sure she was gonna win, you know, even if she lost against Neza, she still would have been able probably to proceed in the program, because she had made it so far in the tournament already.
But it was, like, so personal at that point. The fight where they're punching and kicking and, like, brutalizing each other, but it was a slap that, like, really just set her off.
That is what the condescending attitude about being like, oh my god, yes. Also, that was, like, such a Neza thing to do. Like, just the shame of it.
I just love, like, that's what made her, like, basically sort of unknowingly call upon this god to, like, just finish him. Let's talk about the Carrie-esque period scene, because that, like, I was not expecting that, you know, like, and I loved how, like, she was just so mad at the principle of the matter, like, the fact that was going to be something she would have to deal with every month for the rest of her life, where she was already at such a severe disadvantage to her peers, and how she was just like, oh, hell no, and just took the medication that supposedly kills her womb, like, no questions asked, and all the other girls were like, it kills your womb, why would you want to do that? And she was like, I don't fucking care about babies, like, I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, the sort of anger that comes with, oh, like, this is going to impact me for the rest of my, like, not for the rest of my life, but for the first, like, a big chunk of my life, is like, I related to that rage so hard.
Well, it's also interesting because y'all are in a, like, a military academy, and there's, like, just impending war happening. Like, I don't know what I would do in that situation, but like you might not even live through the war to worry about having kids. Like, and if it's something that's gonna help you like not be at a disadvantage, I can see why Rin did that. She has gone through so much in 200 pages. I can't even begin to imagine what the next couple hundred hold.
Something I sometimes forget about Stephanie is that she's the world's fastest reader. We have to have part 2 done an hour from now so we can have our Zoom chat about it. I have 60 pages left to go and she finished it last night. And she's been like patiently waiting and not reading part 3 so we can talk about it and stay on pace with each other. And I'm sorry, Stephanie. I really am. I'm gonna try to finish this really fast before our chat. Wish me luck. So we begin part 2 pretty much with them facing war in the face. You know, most of Sinigard has been evacuated. A couple sort of groups of students are left defending the city. And yeah, it was a really intense way to kind of start things off in part 2. You have the Federation knocking down the gate in your first real taste of battle, and Rin killing someone for the first time, and she's reflecting that they've been training for years how to fight, but not how to take a life, and that just seems so intense. You know, they pretty much knew they couldn't hold Sinigard. We find Rin and Neza having to defend a gate all by themselves. Everyone else has fallen, and it was what I was waiting for with Neza specifically. Just like they had this years-long grudge, but in the face of the real enemy, they were able to put it aside, and they knew each other's fighting so well from having hated each other so long that they were actually able to complement each other's sort of strengths and weaknesses in battle really well. And that was such a beautiful moment between the two where you could just like feel them set their differences aside for this larger purpose. And oh my goodness, when I thought Neza died, I lost it.
I also, and especially to your point of like them being able to put their differences aside, is also that much more compelling, realizing that in the time jump that you have between the end of part 1, they haven't spoken to each other at all. Like there might be little things here and there where they like interacted in classes, but there was no other way that they like, at least the reader doesn't get that perspective. And so the fact that it's like, okay, you hate each other, you don't talk if you don't have to, but you're able to come together so well.
They've kept an eye on the other for that long, you know, they've watched the other train, and so they still know each other's fighting really intimately. And again, just them holding the gate together was one of my favorite moments in this section of the book. It's what I wanted. It makes their relationship a lot more like layered and not nuanced, rather than just being like, you know, like sort of at each other's throats the whole time. Their relationship really grew in this section, and like I said earlier, I thought Neza was dead.
I was unsure because I was like,
well, the
okay.
Federation
in general, like, you know, ran him through twice, and the second time he goes silent. So I'm like, no, like, you made me love him, and then, like, killed him off immediately. Yeah. And that's part of, like, what helps set Rin off and be able to summon this Phoenix god once more and just completely decimate the Federation soldiers then and there. And so now it's revealed that she is a shaman.
I would like to point out in our last conversation, I had mentioned that I thought she was from Spear, and we were like,
yeah,
I'm not really sure. And then I was like, Oh shit.
So we find Rin sort of thrown into this division that's known as like the freaks and misfits of the army. Yeah, so she's part of this sort of ragtag group of other shaman, and her former school like idol is now her commander, and beyond that, possibly, you know, kin. You know, they're from the same island now they know, and so she feels this kinship with him, but it's a very complicated relationship where, again, he is her commander and she doesn't really know him. So their relationship was really interesting to see sort of evolve, especially as he's kind of pushing her, trying to get her to control her own powers, and her defending Sinigaard and feeling like this, like she felt like she couldn't control this power, that this god like was kind of bursting through the dams of her control. And so now she's kind of, as long as she's been chasing this sort of power to tap into, now she's scared of it. And that's also set her at odds with Alton, which I thought was really interesting. And then the return of Neza, who we thought, like, okay, he's not dead, but he's probably crippled for the rest of his life, but nope, he's okay. And the question of, is he a shaman?
So soon as they had their conversation, Rin came back, and then one of the misfit gang was like, hey, he's a shaman. I like audibly gasped out loud, because again, it's like, I think it's similar to when we were talking about the gatekeeper last time, where when you're not like really paying attention to those details, it's really easy for it to just go over your head before it's revealed. And I feel like it was kind of, not that there's anything really with Neza up until this point to indicate that.
I think just the unnatural healing ability is the only thing, because otherwise he's just a really dedicated fighter, and that's something that's believable, it's realistic. So yeah, him being able to walk just a few weeks later, I was like, what?
I've really enjoyed the growth of their relationship, and even how they've sat down and talked their shit out, basically. You know, they're friends, but like it comes to a point where Rin can't ignore the torment that he put her through in the past, and we get to see him actually acknowledge, like, yeah, sorry, I was kind of an entitled jerk to you, but like you embarrassed me, as if that justifies it. But
it wasn't just one conversation, because it was like it was a couple, like, they're able to like be okay because they're like, oh, I know you. Second conversation, like, no, you did all this to me. And like, there's a lot of people that would have that type of conversation and they're like, nope, I never want to talk
shut down.
Yeah. And the fact that he was like, no, I'm still really sorry, and like, I want you to know that, was like, oh my god, bro.
And now his fate is up in the air again. We see chemical warfare, which I was not expecting.
I wrote that in my notes. I was like, oh, we're doing chemical warfare now. That's great.
So it's very interesting to see sort of R.F. Kuang draw from all these moments in more modern history, because again, I feel like I associate like chemical warfare specifically with like World War I, but we have this setting that feels older than that, you know? We don't see tanks, we don't see planes, you know, the most sort of modern thing we're seeing right now are ships. So it's hard to kind of gauge where in time this is meant to take place.
Which really begs the question, because as we're getting to the end of this part where it's like, oh, this port city isn't the actual intended target at all. It's like,
it's like the wartime capital.
We haven't even seen the extent of what the Federation's power is, because if this isn't intended to be the main spot, why would they waste their most valuable arms?
That's true. Yeah, the defense of Coeur d'Alene has been a distraction this entire time, and like most of their forces are there, so it's really I'm really interested to see I guess the battle is going to be shifting more inland now, to the defense of their new wartime capital. Things are starting to feel really dire. It's intense.
One of the things I really like about not just Rin's relationship with the Phoenix, but just throughout everything we've read so far, is the duality between two opposing forces. And it feels like, especially with her being able to tap into the Phoenix or not, when she was talking with Zhang and she was training under him, it was, you are going to do this in this way, like you are going to respect it, you are not using this in warfare. And then with Alton, we get the complete opposite view, where he's just, like, enraged at her for not being able to understand, like, if this is your birthright, you should know this. And having these two opposing forces of like, no, this is solely for peaceful purposes, you can't do it, or just outright warlord rage sort of vibe. And it's like, I don't feel like, especially just kind of the lead up to it, I don't feel like she's really going to veer either way. Like,
well, yeah, I think she's going to have to meet these philosophies in the middle to not go crazy, basically, because you're already starting to see Alton kind of under the pressure of, you know, the military sort of expectations of him. He's a really young commander, and then also this sort of added weight of being able to call this god and like the toll that takes on his psyche. He's really starting to come apart at the seams a little bit. He's getting a little frenzied. Yeah, I'm very curious to see where it goes from here. So, part 3 of the Poppy War, the last part, it's over, it's done. What were your thoughts?
I feel wrecked. I feel emotionally wrecked. I feel overwhelmed. Like everything about up until this point, some things were proven, some things were completely flipped upside down. So it's been a lot.
In part 3, we really see sort of the aftermath of battle more so than, you know, in the previous section. Rin and her regiment are heading to the wartime capital because that's where the Federation was after all along. But they get there too late. The description of the river full of bodies as they're approaching the city on boat was so intense.
Mm-hmm.
And then their actual approach to the city itself, just the systematic, like, just brutalism that the civilians suffered at the hands of the Federation was so like harrowing.
Yeah.
I was shocked that there were any survivors at all, and we find that Rin's friend Kite was there in his division, and he managed to survive. And he, like, the way he was describing the horrors, it was like, oh my god, it was hard to like process it all, honestly, just because it was so horrible. And this is really what I think brings it, like, I've seen this book categorized as it's adult, but it kind of feels YA, and I can see how in the beginning, like, for sure with the school setting, but this part really kind of solidifies the adult rating I think this book has, is because it was so graphic in its violence.
When they're coming up to the city and you're reading it, before you even find Kite, before you even hear his story, you're kind of wondering, like, how brutal it was. Like, how could this have even happened? And as you're hearing him relay what happened, I don't think it even, like, necessarily matched up to what I was thinking of. And it's hard to, because you're just processing, like, this is just brutal. Like, there's no way of
it's hard to believe that anybody, that people could act like that. You know, we spent this whole book sort of demonizing the Federation, and I know that's like a tactic of war just in general, and that's how, like, you get your soldiers to cope with mass murder. But it's hard to believe that any person could commit an act of violence so atrocious as what we saw in this book. But it's based in reality. Like, that shit happened, and it's horrifying.
It was definitely a lot, and it was kind of interesting to see the interplay of, like, different atrocities that come into this one moment. Because
we get Venka's point of view, and that's like the sexual violence she experienced. Oh my god.
I didn't bring it up last time, but I was wondering in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh, I wonder how Venka is. And then we get it, and it's like, that was maybe the hardest part of this whole section to read.
Yeah,
like, all of it's been pretty brutal, but Venka's part really, I had to close the book and just, like, take a deep breath for a moment before I could even proceed reading.
Yeah. So yeah, we see incredible violence, and Alton specifically, kind of as unhinged as we saw him in the previous section, he kind of goes off on another level in this one. And it's not quite so obvious to Rin at first, because he's very withdrawn in it. But so she finds him smoking opium, and that's, like, literally how he copes with day-to-day life. And so we really see sort of
the horrors of addiction as well.
There was a point in part 2 where it was like, oh, when he gets like this, like we just kind of like take the burden and just deal with it. And at first when you're reading that section, you're like, oh, like he just has times where he like just cannot function. And like it's literally because he uses opium and is like, this is the only way that I can cope with all of the trauma that I've inherited.
Yeah, and experienced firsthand, not just like the genocide of his people, but then we later find out he was experimented on in a lab, and that's like just another layer of hatred that he has for the Federation.
And then even for him to get recaptured was that hurt so bad.
Yeah, so we have him and Rin go off on this crazy Hail Mary mission to this sort of mountain prison that's literally the only place that can trap a shaman and cut them off from their god's powers. And Alton is like, we're gonna free everybody and make this army of shaman. They find that the shaman that have been imprisoned there, like the bodies have decayed, but like the mind still lives and they still have that connection to their god. But like they're not controllable, so like that it was a lost cause sort of thing, which like you knew it was. And the Federation catches up with them and they find out the Empress sold them out, and him and Rin end up back in this research facility. That was like another level of trauma I wasn't expecting, where they're getting doped up with heroin to sort of access their powers so the Federation can like study shamanism. Is like, Jesus Christ.
Definitely something where the history that we get from this, where it's really drawing from the Pacific Theater, this moment really kind of connected that back to a history that more people tend to be familiar with Nazi doctors experimenting on people. And it was just like,
yeah, that's what I thought too.
But the sort of connection that they have when they both end up getting shot with heroin and being able to kind of like see this collective unconscious.
Yeah, they go on this spiritual journey. And again, we see the generational trauma thing play out in a really literal way, where we find out that the Spearly like souls kind of, they don't pass on like the way that normal people do. They're sort of caught in this spiritual like realm of rage. And like they remember everything that their people have gone through, and that feeling, that emotion is part of what powers Alton's sort of connection to the Phoenix and sort of unlocks that for Rin now. So now they're both like human torching it up. They bust out of jail, you know, and Alton makes a decision to stay behind and blow the lab up so that Rin can try to, again, Hail Mary swim to Spear and visit the Phoenix Temple. So Alton's fate is sort of up in the air. I know towards the end they were like, oh, he's gone, but like nobody, I'm not convinced. Same thing with Neza.
I am more like with Neza, I'm like, no, there's no way. With Alton, I'm like, I don't know, man. I'm a little bit more confused with that one, or like,
yeah, I'm not sure. He felt too important to die already. I don't know. It didn't have like the emotional impact of an actual death, and I think that's why I doubt it. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I felt that impact really hard.
Well, I don't know. Also, like, you see, part of like what we know sort of the Phoenix in mythology just in general is sort of like this rebirth from the ashes kind of thing. So that's part of why I'm like, I'm doubtful. I feel like he's gonna have his rebirth moment, you know? I also want to know Rin's background. Where was she as a child? How did she survive this genocide? I don't necessarily know if her parents are important, but like, how did she manage to become like a war orphan on the mainland and like not know that she was Spearly? So I'm hoping one of the next 2 books resolves that, because I feel like that's just sort of up in the air right now, and I'm curious to see if we'll delve into that.
Because all of this leads up to the decision she makes that I'm still just like reeling about.
So she taps into the Phoenix's power in order to basically raise a volcano in the Federation of Mugen, and she wipes them out. That island is gone. And, you know, part of me like understands after seeing the brutality that their soldiers put her people through. But I think Kite provided I'm glad that she had his sort of perspective at the end, kind of pointing out like, you've become what we criticize them for being, you know. She's screaming at him, they're not people, they feel like they're monsters. And it's like, that's how the Federation justified the murder of the Nakara. So it's we see her become a bit of a hypocrite, but we also sort of understand her motivation. So now we're put in this really weird place as a reader who's sympathized with her for this entire book.
I feel like as I was finishing the book, it's like nobody is right here, and I don't know like how to process that moving forward. And like that is how you should feel about it, because it is.
Oh yeah, I mean, war makes the person do horrible things. We've spoken before about how so much happens in each part. It feels like it could have been its own novel. Yeah. And like certain things obviously wrapped up at the end of this, but like there's still so many threads. And again, like we spoke last night and this morning, I'm just emotionally exhausted by it all. I'm definitely curious to see what happens, but I think I need to read a couple like light fluffy books in between.
Something to just kind of break it up a little bit.
Yeah,
it leaves you reeling with so many more questions. And like even as we're getting to the point, or like not towards the end, but when we're going to the mountain and we have the little interlude talking about like what the creation story of this mountain even is, everything that you've learned to this point in the book gets flipped at some point, where it's like, I don't even know how I feel about the treatment of shamans or whether shamans should be a thing after reading the bit on the mountain. And so at every single point in this book, everything that you previously thought you knew just immediately gets flipped again. And so it's only book one.
How many more that's the thing is, like, I'm exhausted and we're only a third of the way there, and that's actually the shortest book in the series. So I feel like I kind of struggled with Rin's character throughout. Like I really liked who she was in the beginning, and I feel like she had a really strong sense of self, but I feel like her relationship with Alton in part 2, like I don't know, I don't want to say changed her, but I just feel like it made her meeker and
it made it more complicated.
Yeah.
And I guess I could see where the feeling would come from, where it's like missing Rin how she was in the beginning.
Before experiencing all this trauma for real.
But then it's also like her life has only been trauma at this point.
Oh, I know.
More so it's like I miss it, but then it's also like, of course it was going to change her from the circumstances. I feel like it was really hard too, where like once you realize that she's Spearly and is assigned in the same unit as Alton, obviously it's war, so you can't really like interact as much in the way that you wanted to, but at least before the point that we're presuming Alton seems dead, but we're not sure. When he goes into like connect foreheads, like that is the one moment that it's like kinship between the two of them, that it's like, that's something that I was really hoping for throughout part 2, but it wrecked me. I cried. I was so sad. Because it was just like, that was something where it was like, obviously we've talked about it before, where it's like there's not really so much of a romantic bit to it, but like you two are the only that remained, and like not in the way that like one of
there's a sense of like she loved him. I just didn't read it as like romantic love. I saw it as sort of the last two people of this now gone race, and like this connection that they had both as like, you know, brothers in arms, as well as like being the last Spearly, and they understood things about each other that only they could understand about each other. And like, yeah, that's a really intimate connection to have now lost if Alton is truly dead.
And like that's what makes it even more so where it's like trying to understand that conversation between her and Kite at the end, where it's like for the reader, you're like, yeah, I'm absolutely like maybe not siding with Kite, but like understanding where he's coming from, because this whole book you're like, genocide is wrong.
Well, yeah, destroying an entire nation is objectively horrible.
Yeah. And then also realizing that it's like,
but you understand her motivations, and that makes you, the reader, feel uncomfortable.
Which I mean, you should feel uncomfortable about it, but like the sort of bit that it's like the only other person that like really understood where she was coming from, or like the sort of feelings that she couldn't really describe but had, like that person is no longer here. I just wrecked. I feel
to sum up, I'm wrecked. It was really good. I gave this after sitting on it for kind of most of the day processing my feelings, I gave this a 4.5, just because I did find it to be a pretty excellent book, but I did have sort of issues with Rin's character throughout, but overall I did enjoy the book, and I thought it was excellently written and so captivating. And you know, it's hard to make, I think, a reader care about that many characters, But I think R.F. Kuang did a really good job with the characters, especially are like why I felt so invested in the book. The plot was exciting as well. Just
I think it's
dramatic.
I think it's something where the characters really drive this home in the way that knowing that it's based so much on this very particular history, it's like if you already know it, you could read the book and like really not care as much. Or if it was just that without compelling characters, I don't think it would be quite as hard hitting as it is. But because you care so much about these characters, it just really drives that history even more. I think I would probably agree with rating, but I think there are some things in terms of either character or just like some bits and pacing that I wish were just a little different. But otherwise, other than that, like one of the best books that I've read.